Over Dan Huff's 50-year career, his musical expression has taken many forms, from playing in Whiteheart alongside his brother, David Huff, to countless sessions throughout the 80s and 90s, to his eventual emergence as the frontman of Giant in 1989, then his relocation back to Nashville, and eventual transition into Grammy-nominated record producer. Today marks the release of Dan's instrumental solo record, When Words Aren't Enough. And I wanted to take this opportunity to look back at Dan's gear from years gone by and to share with you the new pedal that Dan is raving about right now. But before we reveal that pedal, let's revisit Dan's gear from the last 4 decades. When Dan arrived in Los Angeles in the early 80s, the era of Bradshaw racks and Super Strats was in full swing. The story of Dan's 64 Stratocaster is now well documented. Dan wanted a guitar like Steve Lukather's. He sought out Jim Tyler, who was working in the back at Andy Brower's place. Jim modded Dan's then recently acquired 64 and subsequently built him 2 more Tyler Classics, the Yellow Classic, now available in Tyler's current range, and a Blue Classic, which is now owned by my friend Brian Oakes. Dan also had Tyler build him 2 Ultimate Weapons, the red model, seen in Dan's now famous instructional VHS, and a black model, seen in the music video for Stay, very briefly. In this decade, Dan was, like everyone, a big rack user, so let's talk racks. Over the years, staples of Dan's studio rack included preamps such as the Mesa Boogie studio preamp, the Kasher Rock Mod, and later even a Marshall JMP. Power amps were usually either a VHT 2150 or the Mesa Boogie Strategy 400. Dan also had a few amp heads, including a Soldano modded Marshall, a Peavey Classic 50 like the one behind me, and a Peavey 5150 on occasion. For cabinets, Dan would use a pair of Pacific Woodworks 1x12 cabs. Let's talk effects. Dan had it all. In his rack days, he was using a tri-stereo chorus, a Roland Dimension D, a Yamaha SPX 90, an Eventide H3000, the TC 1210 spatial expander, and for delay, predominantly a TC 2290, but later on a Roland SDE 330. Dan was very much an amp gain kind of guy during this period. He did have a selection of Boss pedals that he called his junkers, but the majority of his 80 sessions were apparently recorded with the Mesa Boogie studio preamp. When Dan moved back to Nashville in the 90s, rack tones began to fall out of favour. His rig became much more stripped back, predominantly using a matchless HD30 with an MXR Dynacomp sometimes running into the front, and minimal back-end processing. As the 90s merged into the 2000s, Dan's role shifted from guitar player to producer, and we only saw glimpses of him playing for the next decade or so. About 10 years ago, I recalled seeing a pedalboard that Mason from Vertex had put together for Dan, but the story here was not what I was expecting.
It was probably 10 or 12 years ago.
Yeah.
It was a long time ago. And it wasn't, I would say, an official board build in the case of like where somebody would come to me when I was still building pedal boards and say, this is what I'm looking for. Here are the pedals, do your thing. This was like, um, I think the directive was, I'm paying so much money in cartage, or we're paying so much money in cartage for Tom Bukovac's pedalboard. Why don't I just buy a replica of his board that can just live, in the studio, and that way we don't have to transport it. And
That
then I
makes
can get it
total
back.
sense. That
Because
makes, yeah.
Bukovac, I think there's been more people in the fold subsequently, but at that time, I think he was working with Bukovac, almost daily.
Mm.
And I think Bukovac probably needed, at that time, I don't know if he had as many boards. Exact Tone wasn't in Nashville yet. And so, or I guess maybe they were, but it wasn't the same. It was called Kingdom Amps at the time, and it was just Barry. And so they hadn't yet kind of formed it as Exact Tone Nashville as we know it now. And yeah, it was basically just a replica of what Book's board was at the time.
Fast forward to the last year, and footage of Dan playing guitar in his studio began circulating online. A few months later, we saw the first Huff pedalboard emerge in a long time, this time built by XTS in Nashville, or Exact Tone Solutions. This board featured some Nashville favourites, the exotic RC booster, the XTS Winford, and a modded blues driver. So which Overdrive was Dan using on his solo record? Well, Dan's rig for When Words Aren't Enough actually predates his XCS pedalboard. According to Dan, the majority of When Words Aren't Enough was recorded with his 64 Strat into an old Boss SD2 dual overdrive straight into the Rev D40, which Dan had recently taken a shine to. Mason had a great story about how Dan came to use this specific and not particularly coveted overdrive pedal.
We talked before we started recording about how the pedal that was actually used on the record was this Boss pedal. Was it
SD2, I think, yeah.
SD2. And I had speculated that he had gotten that from Bukovac, because Bukovac used to use that a lot in the early 2000s. And in Dan's sort of justification for using it was not that he like sought out all these overdrives and sorted through them. It was kind of like that was just set up, and the amp was kind of like set up because he had been Derek from Rev had brought that amp over, and they had been going through it, and he was recording tracks, and that was kind of just like what was there, the path of least resistance that became the sound of the record. And so it wasn't like he was going through these pedals and trying to figure out like what's the best sound. The funny thing is that he said he used it because he had gone to see Mike Landau with James Taylor in Nashville, and he had asked Mike what he had used, and he thought that he had said this SD2, but really we know he said the SD9, the Maxton. And so Dan was under the impression that this was the pedal that Mike Landau told him to use, and that's kind of why it was even out amongst all the pedals that he has.
No way. That's it.
That's kind of a funny story that viewers of our stuff will appreciate as likely Landau fans.
However, this isn't the overdrive that I've been using for these musical examples today. Following the release of Mason's second interview with Dan, he posted this clip.
Sounds great to me. I would have used it on the record. I would have. I mean, I'm not joking. I really like this. So it's fit the spot.
I thought Dan's tone here was killer, so I text Mason to find out what Dan was using.
Yeah, that was the Ultraphonics Overdrive. And usually when we go and visit artists that are that have a proclivity for pedals, we'll bring them maybe like a few little things. And the irony of the Ultraphonics is I did bring him one, but it turned out that I had actually already brought him one the last time we had seen him. And so, when I brought it to him, he's like, I think I have that already. And so we look in his sort of pedal vault that's kind of, in a closet, that's off camera. And he's like, oh yeah. He's like, yeah, it's right there, and he's like, yeah, or I remember seeing it. He's like, but I don't think I've ever used it. He's like, well, let's just, to kind of humor me. He's like, let's just plug them in, And so he kind of was in his pedalboard, which was beautifully done by Exactone. I think he realized that like some of the devices were not, he was kind of I think taking advice from guys like Bukovac and stuff like that to kind of figure out where to start. And I think practically he realized that like things like the Empress EQ were kind of like beyond his abilities. So anyway, he took that off and he was kind of substituting a few things kind of in the middle of the pedalboard signal path. And so he put the ultraphonics on there and he starts playing with it. And he's like, well, I really like this, and to me, I'm thinking, and this is not what's on camera yet. I was thinking like, yeah, he's like a nice guy, like he's just trying to flatter me. I brought him some pedals. He's being generous with, his compliments and stuff like that. He's like, yeah, I really like that. It's great. And he's like, show me some of the other ones, and so we were plugging in some of the other ones. He's like, oh, this is great too. And anyway, he's like, yeah, let's leave the steel string pedal on here and let's leave the ultraphonics on here. And I'll plug in this chorus that I have here, this TC chorus, and just to complete the signal path. And, we'll roll with the pedalboard like this for the interview. I was like, all right, great. Like, fine. But I kind of didn't have any expectation that, again, I just thought he was kind of humoring me for, to be nice about the gifts. So fast forward to, we go through all of the parts about, the classic records, and he plays those parts. Then we get to his record and he's using it to sort of recreate some of those sounds from the record. And he says like, oh, I would have used this on the record. And I'm kind of laughing, thinking like, oh yeah, again, he's being a nice guy. And, and he asked me to kind of plug it. So I talk about it and what it is, but, I still am a little bit, even at the point with which I left that interview, I was still sort of like, yeah, that was really nice of him, but like, we'll see if this gets used. I get a call a couple of days later from another guy that has interviewed Dan before and interviewed him again, named Zach Kuhn. And he said, hey man, I just wanted you to know, like, Huff's raving about this pedal and he used it in our interview and he's saying how great it is. And then I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I another guy that I know, is over there who works with him kind of professionally, like, yeah, he's raving about this pedal.
So I ordered one. I plugged it into my Classic 50 and I set about recreating the musical samples you've heard in this video today, all of which are excerpts from Dan's new record, When Words Aren't Enough. If you'd like to learn these songs, check out the Session Heroes Patreon. So there you have it. Dan's current favorite overdrive is the Vertex Ultraphonics Mark II running into his Rev D40 amp. I think this is a cool pedal and it certainly seems reflective of where Dan is with his playing right now. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've tried to do Dan's new music justice, but we all know there's no substitute for the real thing. So make sure that you go out and buy a copy of his new record, When Words Aren't Enough. I certainly will be doing the same. I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.